Have you ever stopped to think about how communities define themselves, especially over like millennia, and whose version of their story we usually end up hearing?
Yeah, because often history really is shaped by those holding the pen, so to speak.
Exactly. And today we're taking a deep dive into the fascinating and often pretty fiercely contested history of the Samaritans.
Right. This isn't just dusty ancient history either. It's really about identity, enduring identity, the power of sacred texts, and, how different stories, different narratives can profoundly shape how we understand a whole people.
Absolutely. And to get into this, we've got a really rich stack of sources we're drawing on.
We do. Things like ancient scriptural translations of the Book of Sirach, for example. Then there are the detailed historical accounts from Flavius Josephus, who's a key figure here.
Definitely. Plus, scholarly analyses looking at the unique Samaritan Pentateuch, their version of the first 5 books of the Bible.
And even some, surprising cultural connections, like their engagement with astrology, which most people probably don't know about.
Our mission, then, is to kind of distill the most important insights from all these different materials. Give you a shortcut, really, to being well-informed about the Samaritans.
Yeah, hopefully with plenty of surprising facts and those aha moments along the way to keep you hooked.
Okay, let's unpack this then.
Let's do it.
So maybe start with what seems simple, but actually isn't. How do we even talk about the Samaritans? The terminology itself is debated, right?
It really is. It gets interesting right away. Scholars often make this distinction, you see, between Samaritan, referring to the religious community specifically, and Samarian.
Samarian meaning just
Yeah.
anyone living in the region, geographically.
Precisely. Anyone living in the geographical area of Samaria. It's a crucial difference, and it highlights how nuanced historical terms can be.
So who made these distinctions?
Well, a key scholar, Frank Moore Cross, he used Samarian for the geographical residents and Samaritan for the religious group. But even he admitted historical usage dies hard.
Meaning it's tough to change old habits.
Yeah, exactly. People get used to a term, even if it's less precise. Another scholar, Knoppers, he went further, distinguishing between Judeans and Samaritans back in the Persian and early Hellenistic times, and then the later, more clearly defined Jews and Samaritans in, say, the Maccabean and Roman periods.
But he still saw connections between them.
Oh, yes, while still acknowledging lines of continuity. So the very words we pick carry a lot of historical and, frankly, scholarly weight.
Okay.
Right.
And speaking of influential narratives shaping things, we absolutely have to talk about Flavius Josephus.
Mm-hmm.
Can't avoid him. He's often seen as the main historical source for this whole period, and his accounts have really shaped traditional views. But how did he actually portray the Samaritans? Was he neutral?
Neutral, not really. Josephus often paints the Samaritans in a, let's say, strikingly negative light.
How so?
He kept emphasizing what he saw as their recent and impure origins, compared to what he presented as the ancient and pure Jewish race.
Ouch, that's pretty loaded language.
It is. He frequently called them Kothians, which is a term from the biblical Book of 2 Kings. It basically implied they weren't part of legitimate Judaism.
So outsiders, essentially.
Yes, and he even sort of implicitly tagged them as renegade Jews who were expelled from Jerusalem. It definitely makes you pause and ask, okay, how reliable is Josephus here when it comes to the Samaritans specifically?
That's a massive question, isn't it? Especially given how much his writings are relied upon, if he's spinning the narrative that hard.
Exactly. How much can we really trust his version? Some scholars, like Helm, they even speculate Josephus might have, fabricated his stories about the Samaritans.
Yeah, fabricated. Wow.
Or, maybe less extreme, perhaps uncritically used existing oral traditions that just happened to fit his timeline and his negative portrayal. He often used biblical stuff to suggest that the problems between Jews and Samaritans in his day actually had roots way, way back.
So maybe not always objective history, but sometimes pushing an agenda, a polemic.
It certainly looks that way sometimes. Yeah, an underlying polemical agenda seems plausible in some cases.
Fascinating. Okay, but what about the Samaritans themselves? Did they just accept this negative label from Josephus? Or did they have their own story?
Oh, they definitely didn't accept Josephus's framing. Not at all. There's this really telling account, actually, in Josephus's own writings, where he describes them petitioning King Antiochus.
And what did they say?
They claimed to be Sidonians by origin, completely different. They suggested their cult, their worship, was a continuation of the ancient Canaanites, specifically Sidonians.
Sidonians, how did they connect that?
They linked their sacred city, Shechem, to ancient Salem, and even traced their descent through figures like King Ahab's Sidonian wife Jezebel, though maybe not highlighting Jezebel directly, but the Sidonian connection.
Wow, that is worlds away from Josephus saying they were colonists from the Medes and Persians.
Absolutely. It really throws into sharp relief just how contested this identity was from multiple angles, each, with its own narrative and perhaps its own agenda.
So we've got these competing origin stories flying around. What then really became the defining factor? The thing that, in the sources at least, marked them out as a distinct group?
Well, what becomes crystal clear in the source material we've looked at is the temple, the existence of the temple on Mount Gerizim. That functions as the singular criterion for defining the Samaritans as a distinct religious group.
Just the temple.
Pretty much. Before it was built, the population in the region, they might have been geographically identifiable, sure, but they lacked this specific distinguishing religious marker that really set them apart.
Ah, I see. So it wasn't just where they lived, but fundamentally where they worshipped that solidified their identity in the eyes of others, and maybe themselves too.
Precisely. It really underscores how central religious practice and, crucially, a shared sacred space were to forming communal identity back then.
Makes perfect sense. Okay, let's shift gears a bit from identity to their sacred texts. The Book of Sirach, for instance. It's a rich source, but you mentioned it caused some headaches, especially for early Greek translators.
Oh, absolutely. It really did. The original Greek translation of Ben Sirah's Hebrew text, done by his own grandson, interestingly, and even later versions we use today, like the Nets or the NRSV.
Those are common modern Bible translations?
Right. They all have to grapple with some significant textual layers. For example, there's what scholars call a later Greek recension, known as GKII. Basically, a later version where quite a few proverbs got added to the book.
Added later. How did translations handle that?
Differently. Nets, for instance, puts these added bits in italics and brackets right in the main text. The NRSV often shunts them off into footnotes. So right away, you can see the text itself has this complex, layered history.
And you mentioned linguistic quirks. That sounds like it would make translation even trickier.
It often did, yeah. The translator, Ben Sirah's grandson, seems to have aimed for a very literal, almost one-for-one translation of the Hebrew. But the resultant Greek often felt, stilted and awkward.
Can you give an example?
Sure. You see these subtle grammatical shifts. Like in Sirach 13.22, the verb tense suddenly flips from present to aorist, like going from is happening to happened, which can feel a bit jarring if you're reading the Greek.
Okay.
Or another thing is the frequent use of anarthrous nouns. That just means nouns without the definite article, without the...
Like saying king instead of the king.
Exactly. So in chapter 50, describing the temple service, it might say, by altar's hearth, instead of by the altar's hearth. Now, contextually, it's clearly the Jerusalem temple altar, but the Greek phrasing itself is less explicit. It can create a bit of ambiguity.
So it's not just a technical challenge for translators. It actually shows something about how they approach the text.
I think so. It shows how the ancient world wrestled with translating profound religious ideas. Sometimes they prioritized being super literal to the Hebrew, even if the Greek wasn't perfectly smooth. It suggests a deep reverence for that source text.
Those little details really can shift the feel, can't they?
Yeah.
Or maybe even the meaning subtly. Could you share a few memorable sayings or proverbs from Sirach itself?
Oh, definitely. Some of them really stick with you. For instance, an evil eye is envious over bread, and it is lacking on his table.
A vivid picture of resentment and stinginess.
Right. Or this piece of practical wisdom. Before you die, treat a friend well, and according to your strength, reach out and give to him. A call to generosity while you still have the chance.
Quite direct.
It is. And then there's this one, maybe a bit provocative. Have you heard a word? Let it perish along with you. Be brave. It will never make you burst.
Wow. A strong warning against gossip. Keep secrets.
Definitely. And there are contrasting ideas, too, like a wise word. If one who understands hears it, he will praise it and will add to it. He who lives luxuriously heard and was displeased with it, and he turned it aside behind his back.
So wisdom versus what? Superficiality.
Seems like it. And then even stronger. Like a house that has been raised, so is wisdom to a foolish person, and an ignorant person's knowledge is meaningless words. Sirach definitely doesn't mince words about wisdom versus ignorance.
No kidding. Those last few pack a punch. Okay, let's move to another absolutely critical sacred text for the Samaritans. The Samaritan Pentateuch, the SP. How is it different from the Masoretic text, the MT, which is the standard Hebrew text for Jews?
Right, the SP. It's a distinct version, and the differences are really fascinating. One key feature you notice is this tendency towards harmonization.
Harmonization, meaning what exactly?
Meaning it often smooths out little inconsistencies, lexical or grammatical things that you might find in the MT.
Like typos. Or just variations.
More like variations or slightly different ways of saying things. For example, Genesis 31.33 in the MT mentions maidservants. The SP changes it to handmaids to match how they're referred to elsewhere. Consistency.
Ah, okay. Little tweaks for internal consistency.
Exactly. Or Genesis 15.10, the MT says the bird, singular. But earlier in the verse, two birds were mentioned, so the SP reads the birds, plural. Makes more sense contextually.
Logical fix.
Even names get harmonized. Jethro's father-in-law is called Jether in Exodus 4.18 in the MT, but Jethro elsewhere. The SP just calls him Jethro there, too.
Standardizing it.
Right. And maybe the most famous example, the Sabbath commandment. Exodus 20.8 in the MT says, remember the Sabbath. Deuteronomy 5.12 says, observe the Sabbath. The SP changes the Exodus verse to observe, making both passages match the Deuteronomic wording.
Interesting. So it suggests a very conscious effort to create a text that felt more internally consistent, maybe easier to read or understand.
That seems to be the driving force behind many of these changes, yes. A kind of editorial polishing for consistency.
What about its physical form, the script it's written in, or how it was passed down?
Good question. The SP uses a script that's directly descended from the Paleo-Hebrew script.
Paleo-Hebrew, what's that?
It's an older form of the Hebrew alphabet, different from the square Aramaic script that Judaism eventually adopted and that you see in most Hebrew Bibles today.
And the Samaritans stuck with the older one.
Right. It seems to have been a very deliberate choice to emphasize the Mosaic character of the Pentateuch. Using the older script visually reinforced its ancient origins and its direct link back to Moses himself. This script then became standard for other Samaritan texts, too.
That's a powerful statement, just in the choice of script. And how about passing it down? Was it just written?
Well, this is important, too. The SP has unique pronunciation traditions, things you wouldn't necessarily know just from looking at the written consonants. It highlights how crucial oral transmission was alongside the written text in preserving their faith.
Like how they actually said the words.
Exactly. For instance, the Hebrew word for there spelled shinmem, they always pronounce it shama, with that A vowel sound, even though the standard written text doesn't explicitly show that vowel. Or the word for name is pronounced differently from the word for reputation, even though they look identical in the unvocalized text. Oral tradition preserved those distinctions.
That adds a whole other layer, doesn't it? A linking tradition beyond just the letters on the page. Now, you mentioned something really intriguing earlier, that some research suggests the SP might actually preserve older readings than the MT in some places.
Yes, that's a pretty significant claim, and it could potentially shift some long-held views about biblical text history.
How so? What's the evidence?
Well, there's some strong research suggesting just that. For example, there's a fragment discovered in Qumran Cave 4, near the Dead Sea. It's labeled 4Q something. This fragment actually has the word Gerizim in Deuteronomy 27.4-6.
Mount Gerizim, the Samaritan holy mountain.
Exactly. It says to build the altar on Gerizim, as it is customary among the Samaritans. And this Qumran fragment also reads with the Samaritan Pentateuch in verse 6 against the MT.
Wow, so a Dead Sea Scroll fragment aligns with the Samaritan version.
Correct. Which suggests that, in this instance at least, the Samaritans might have preserved the older reading, and that the text was actually altered later in the Masoretic tradition, maybe changing Gerizim to Ebal.
That really challenges the automatic assumption that the MT is always the original or oldest, doesn't it?
It certainly does. It reminds us that the history of the text is complex, and there might not be one single definitive original that fits all cases. Multiple textual traditions existed side by side.
Really fascinating. Okay, let's talk about Moses for a second. Our sources mentioned a significant discussion about Moses in relation to the prophets. What was the core issue there? What was the contention about?
This was a really major point of theological difference, and it profoundly shaped Samaritan identity. The Samaritans consistently upheld Moses as the absolute greatest prophet, the ultimate authority.
More than Isaiah or Jeremiah.
Way more. Their tradition shows a really consistent attitude against the prophets who came after Moses. For them, Moses was paramount.
And this disagreement was happening when?
Well, interestingly, this internal Jewish debate, because it started as an internal debate, seems to have predated the final official canonization of the prophetic books, which happened around 200 BCE.
So before the Jewish Bible as we know it was fully settled.
Right, and it clearly continued even after that. The sources say that pre-Samaritan manuscripts revealed that the discussion in the Hebrew Bible was already ongoing. For the Samaritans, though, the conclusion was clear. Moses and the Pentateuch, the Torah, that was it. They essentially stopped their sacred canon right there with the 5 books of Moses.
That really draws a sharp line, doesn't it? Sets the stage for understanding their distinct path.
No.
Now, let's dive into the often messy reality of their history. The interactions, the hostilities they faced. Tensions were obviously high, especially around the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple after the Babylonian exile. What do the sources say about those early clashes?
Josephus, again, he describes significant tensions during that rebuilding period. He recounts how the surrounding nations, and he specifically points to the Qumran, his term for Samaritans, actively intervened.
Intervened how?
They went to the Persian authorities to try and stop the building of the temple in Jerusalem. This is in his Antiquities.
Why would they do that?
Josephus claims these Qumran, who are called Samaritans, were basically angry because the Jews had refused to let them help build the temple. So in retaliation, they convinced others to hinder the construction. It paints a picture of pretty deep animosity right from that post-exilic moment.
So being excluded from the Jerusalem project kind of fueled that division, and then eventually led them to build their own temple on Mount Gerizim. Josephus talks about that too, right?
He does. Josephus tells the story of Sanballat, a Samaritan leader, promising his son-in-law Manasseh, who was actually from a priestly family in Jerusalem, but got expelled, that he would build him a temple on Mount Gerizim.
And he got permission.
He says Sanballat got Alexander's permission, Alexander the Great. Although Josephus's timeline here is a bit confusing, he seems to split the construction into 2 phases, one under the Persian king Darius III and another under Alexander.
Okay, so they build their own center of worship, but what happened to it?
Well, crucially, Josephus also records that this temple on Gerizim was laid waste, completely destroyed, about 200 years later.
Destroyed by whom?
By the Hasmonean ruler John Hyrcanus, around 111 or 110 BCE. This destruction was obviously a pivotal, devastating event for the Samaritans.
Definitely. Now, what about archaeology? What do actual digs on Mount Gerizim tell us about the temple and the worship there? Does it back up Josephus's sometimes negative view of their practices?
Actually, no, quite the opposite. The archaeological finds from the Hellenistic period on Mount Gerizim, they strongly suggest worship to Yahweh on the mountain. And crucially, no other divine names are found.
Just Yahweh, the God of Israel.
Exactly, which directly refutes any ideas Josephus or others might hint at about some kind of syncretistic tendency, mixing Yahweh worship with other gods. The archaeology points pretty clearly to exclusive Yahweh worship, much like what was happening in Jerusalem.
That's a really important counterpoint to the textual bias. It's clear these tensions were deep-seated, and we see echoes even in the New Testament, right? How do those texts usually frame the Samaritans?
Yeah, the New Testament definitely reflects the tensions between the 2 communities. You have famous lines like in John 4.9, "For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." That's pretty stark.
It is, but is that the whole picture in the New Testament?
Not entirely. It's important to note that these texts, while acknowledging the tension, do not see the Samaritans as standing outside of the Israelite tradition altogether.
So not complete outsiders.
No. They're typically depicted as, well, related to the Jews, but at the same time as standing somehow between Jews and Gentiles, a kind of unique in-between position.
Interesting.
And furthermore, some other sources from that Second Temple period, like the books of 2 Maccabees and Tobit, they actually show that some Judeans considered the people living in Samaria to be part of the Jewish community.
Really? Under what conditions?
The main condition seems to have been accepting the Jerusalem temple as the central place of worship. So it's actually a much more nuanced picture than the simple Jews versus Samaritans conflict we often imagine. It highlights internal Jewish debates about boundaries just as much as Samaritan distinctiveness.
That nuance is crucial. Okay, let's jump forward to the Roman period. Were there specific incidents then that really escalated these long-standing tensions? Or maybe, surprisingly, moments where they found common ground against a common enemy?
Yes, definitely several notable incidents during Roman rule. For example, the Samaritans actually accused Pontius Pilate. Yes, that Pontius Pilate before the Roman governor of Syria, Vitellius, around 35-39 CE.
Accused him of what?
Essentially of persecuting them. They claimed his actions against a gathering on Mount Gerizim were unjustified violence, arguing their gathering was religious, not rebellious.
Another clashes.
Josephus, predictably, recounts a violent clash where he says Samaritans attacked Galilean Jews who were traveling through Samaria on their way to a festival in Jerusalem. And in telling this story, Josephus again depicts Samaritans as slanderers and payers of bribes, reinforcing his usual negative portrayal.
Always the bias with Josephus, it seems. But what about finding common ground? Against Rome, perhaps?
Well, this is really interesting. During the massive Jewish revolt against Rome that started in 66 CE, the sources suggest it's most improbable that the Samaritans were just bystanders, maybe incited by Jewish successes.
So they likely joined in.
It's considered most likely that they actually made common cause with the Jews against the Romans. Why? Because they were probably as much opposed to their rule as were the Jews. So yes, facing a powerful common enemy like Rome could, it seems, temporarily override their own internal disputes.
That shared struggle against Roman domination is a powerful potential unifier, even if temporary. Now, you've mentioned Josephus's anti-Samaritan exegesis, his biased interpretation a few times. Can you give us another concrete example of how he subtly, or maybe not so subtly, tweaked biblical stories to fit his agenda?
Absolutely. It's quite striking. Despite promising in his Antiquities preface that he wouldn't alter the biblical accounts, he definitely introduced modifications. And many scholars are convinced that certain modifications introduced by Josephus were directed against the Samaritans.
Like what?
Okay, so take his summary of the book of Judges. Josephus really enhances the prestige of Shiloh as the central Israelite sanctuary during that period.
That's Shiloh where the Ark of the Covenant was kept for a time.
Exactly. But in doing so, he conspicuously omits mentioning other sanctuaries that the biblical text itself talks about from that same period.
Why omit them?
The thinking is this was potentially done deliberately to diminish the position of Gerizim. By elevating Shiloh and ignoring other potential early cult sites, he implicitly weakens any claim Gerizim might have to ancient legitimacy as a sacred place.
Ah, so it's a subtle undermining tactic.
It strongly suggests Josephus was engaged in a conscious polemic against the Samaritans and the cult on Mount Gerizim, actively using his retelling of history and scripture to shape perceptions and undermine a rival community.
Wow. That's a powerful reminder of how history writing itself can be a battleground, even when retelling sacred stories.
Yeah.
Okay, now for something completely different and honestly quite surprising, Samaritans and astrology. Tell us about this hidden tradition.
Yeah, this one is truly unexpected, isn't it? It really opens up a different window onto their, let's say, broader intellectual world. Our sources actually reveal that Samaritans did, in fact, engage in astrology.
Seriously, like horoscopes and predictions.
Exactly. There are actual Samaritan astrological treatises that have been found, and they contain horoscopes, including their prognostications, their predictions based on the stars.
Okay, that's interesting in itself, but you mentioned a connection.
This is the really fascinating part. The sources note how similar horoscopes appear in Samaritan astrological treatises and how some of the diagrams they use, well, they correspond with ancient astrological diagrams found far away.
How far away?
Figures found in Central India and South India, diagrams labeled Figure 6, Central India, and Figure 9, South India, show remarkable correspondence with diagrams in these Samaritan texts.
Wait, Samaritans in the ancient Near East sharing astrological diagrams with India. How?
That's the million-dollar question. But it's not just a quirky detail. It strongly hints at these surprising, probably indirect, cross-cultural intellectual exchanges and knowledge-sharing happening in ancient times across vast distances, far beyond what you might typically assume for community often portrayed as somewhat isolated.
That really challenges the image of neat, separate, ancient cultures, doesn't it? It suggests a much more interconnected world, at least intellectually.
Absolutely. It truly challenges our assumptions about how ideas traveled and who was talking to whom, even indirectly, in the ancient world.
Incredible. Okay, so we've really covered a lot of ground today. We've navigated this really complex landscape of Samaritan identity, faith, and how history gets interpreted. You've seen how their identity was so profoundly shaped by their sacred texts, like the unique Samaritan Pentateuch, their special relationship with the law of Moses, and of course their central sanctuary on Mount Gerizim.
Yeah, and we've also had to unpack the significant biases, especially in Josephus's accounts, which colored how they were seen for centuries.
Right. And then uncovered these really surprising cross-cultural connections, like the whole astrology link to India.
That was a fascinating detour.
It was. And this deep dive, I think it really shows us that history is rarely just one single straightforward story, is it?
Not at all. It's almost always layered. Different perspectives, evolving traditions, sometimes even deliberate attempts, like we saw with Josephus, to shape how people understand things.
And understanding that process, understanding that history has layers and biases, that helps you, the listener, critically evaluate information you encounter in your own life, whether you're, I don't know, prepping for a work meeting or just exploring a new topic online.
Absolutely. That critical lens is invaluable.
So here's a final thought to maybe chew on. What does this all really mean? If ancient communities like the Samaritans could hold on to their distinct identity and traditions for literally centuries.
Despite being interpreted and often misrepresented by more dominant narratives around them.
Yeah. What does that tell you about the sheer resilience of culture, of belief, and maybe how looking for those alternate histories, the less heard voices, might enrich how you understand the world around you today?